Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll just give it a few minutes for people to get connected into us. My name's Carl Latham. I work with my colleagues in the fundraising and management unit at MOOR Kingston Smith, and I work in the impact team. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. I was just looking at some research the other day. And it's a COVID-19 attitude tracker, and it says that for the first time in 7 weeks of tracking, more people think the worst is now behind us than think the worst is yet to come. So hey, there's a bit of optimism there. Fewer than 59% believe that life will have returned to something close to normal by the end of this year. That's still a majority, but it's down from 86% just a month ago. So you can imagine what we were like 2 months ago. We could just see about a week ahead, and now people are looking to the end of the year and hoping that things will improve. So, hey, things are looking a little better. So, am I good to go? Yes. I think we'll get kicked off. It's really pleased to welcome you all today, and we're going to be talking a little bit about impact measurement and why it's still a good idea. This is just essentially what we'll be looking at today. We'll do a bit of introduction. We're going to just speak briefly about some of the language around impact and defining that. And then I suppose we're going to talk a little about both the how and why of impact. We're not going to get too much into methodology and theory, but we're going to talk a little bit about how you go about actually setting up an impact process. And then quite a bit of the rest of our time today is going to be looking at why it's still a good idea to be looking at this stuff. And then we'll look at some specific aspects. And we're also going to have time to bring someone in who's worked with us on impact. So I'll be delighted to introduce you later to Bruce Leake, who's the CEO of Suffolk Libraries. And we're just going to talk a little bit together about how that worked out in practice. And then we can have some questions after that. So this is MOOR Kingston Smith. We've been around for a while, since 1923, this tells us. We recently joined a global network, so we're now MOOR Kingston Smith, but we work specifically in the charity field. And you can see there we've got 14 specialist partners who work in the charity field, and also for a couple of years running now, we've won awards around our audit survey. In the audit survey, we've won awards around our support to charities. So we're quite proud of that. And I suppose on the periphery of Kingston Smith, there are a number of other units, and we belong to the fundraising and management unit. So here are the people in front of you now who belong to that unit. And I'm pleased to welcome quite a few of my colleagues online here today. So we've got Penny Court, who works with me on the impact side of things. We've got Marcus Lees-Melez, who's one of our finance colleagues. And we've also got Dan Fletcher, who's the director of our fundraising work. So if you have questions in those areas, I'm delighted to say my colleagues are around today, and they'll be in a position to answer your questions. If you have questions about impact, of course, we'll do our best to answer that as well. And you can use the chat function. It's the little square box at the bottom there. You can click into that, and then you can chat to the wider group. So if you have a burning question, do please feel free to come on there and ask what you need to ask. So let's move on. One of the first things I want to do is just talk about defining impact. It's really important that we know what we mean by this stuff. Certainly when we talk to charities who come to talk to us about working together, we find these days there's quite a lot of different language now around this world of impact. I was certainly involved a long time ago now, before I cared to, remember that going back all that time. I was certainly involved in creating the methodology that was known as social return on investment. And we kind of revised and reviewed that methodology for use here in the UK. And I was one of 7 or 8 people who wrote the guide to social return on investment. And what I've found in the ensuing years is that a lot of people have got involved in the work, and some people have kind of taken bits of it and rebranded it, or kind of added bits. And I think one of the kind of effects of that is that we've got a lot of similar concepts using different language. And I suppose that's a slight negative, but the positive side of that is that more people are involved in this stuff and are using the language of impact. So that's a real good thing, where people have come and kind of owned parts of the methodology. However, at MOOR Kingston Smith, we think of impact as the value you put on the outcomes that you create. And there's this bit in the middle here about what would happen anyway. People often use the rather fancy term of the whole area of counterfactual stuff. But essentially, impact is the value of outcomes we create, less the value that might have happened without us. And I know in charities we hate to actually contemplate that things could actually happen without us, but there is no impact report worth its salt that doesn't take account of value that's created by other agencies, if you like. So to hone down right to an initial definition, for us, impact is the value of change that's attributable to you. And that's kind of how our systems that we use with charities, that's the kind of fundamental core of how we work. So those of you who know a bit about impact, you'll not be surprised to see these. In a sense, it's not rocket science. It's still an analysis of the interplay of these particular elements, the inputs, outputs, outcome, and the impact itself. So inputs is relatively straightforward, isn't it? It's the resources that we need to have in order to run an activity. That can be straightforward, except sometimes when it actually comes to identifying what those inputs are and the costs of them. Particularly if you're looking at an impact piece which only looks at a part of your organization, sometimes it's harder, let's say, to actually identify the actual costs of that activity. Outputs are sometimes divided into 2 areas. Sometimes people regard activities and outputs as slightly different things. Activity being the program itself, let's say, and the outputs being the kind of metrics that you use to measure those actual activities. So that might mean, the number of people completing a training program or something like that. I don't think it's necessary to separate them actually, and so we tend to just keep outputs as a description of the actual program and activities, and sometimes they're expressed numerically. But outcomes, well, that's the kind of gold, the golden bullet that we're trying to shoot with all this. We're actually trying to get to the point where we're talking about what change comes about as a result of our work. And so the whole impact story that's evolved over the years has largely been, about an outcomes-led analysis. And I've talked a wee bit about impact being the value adjustments that are made that allow you to make sure that what you're claiming is attributable to you as a project or organisation. Just some areas in this that I think are worth looking at before we move on. What do activities really cost? You know, this is a big issue for us when we're often talking to people, particularly people who want to create an SROI analysis where they want to work out a return, a social return on investment. And so the issue here is really getting to the point of trying to identify, well, what do the activities that lead to the outcomes we're chasing, what do they actually really cost? And that's why it's really useful to have our colleagues from finance on board, where they're really able to help a charity look at the whole specialism around properly identifying costs. On the output side, this is something I've been thinking quite a bit about recently, the actual efficacy of outputs. It's not a word we normally use in this context, but if efficacy is something about being sure that a particular action or activity consistently leads to a particular change or a particular effect, then this is really important in this area. Very often we say that if we work with people in a charity, let's say we work with a problem, and if we work with that problem, a change will take place and something much more positive will happen. And so outcome B or outcome C happens as a result of our work. Very often that causal link isn't actually interrogated terribly strongly, and very often people can say, well, will outcome B happen, or will outcome C happen as a result of that? So it's really important, I think, when we're thinking about how we go about measuring impact, to think very clearly about the causal link and this efficacy of our work and what it leads to. Outcomes, well, it's very often the case that when we look at a particular strand or string of things that happen as a result of our work, we could go on naming outcomes, until well, forever. And it's very important, I think, that we think of the most material outcomes that our work is creating. So we used to say, don't sweat the small stuff, didn't we? And there's something here about making sure that the most important changes that our work brings about are the things that we should focus on. And social value accountancy, if you like, is borrowing something of the materiality concept from both the world of finance, investing, and also accountancy. So the secret here is to focus on the big stuff that's changing and use that as the basis of the claims you're making to create social value. And finally, as I said, the impact itself, make sure that what you're claiming is really down to you. So the analysis of these four areas, plus these red flags, if you like, are really important areas that will get you started in this particular field. Just touching on some of the debates around, the world of impact. And one of these for a long time has been about, whether we should actually place a financial value on the changes that we're bringing about. And, well, from our point of view, if you're going to actually account for the social value you create, you do need to get into this area of thinking about the actual value of change. And particularly when you're looking at a number of different changes or outcomes for the people you're working with, then the only way I feel that you can actually judge the relative value of those outcomes is to go ahead and use this monetization process. And that's what we certainly do. Well, we're an accountancy firm after all, but there's other areas of the work where people are putting a value judgment on change, maybe a smiley face or an unhappy face, and some of that can work, in a kind of interim sense. But ultimately, to judge the value of outcomes, particularly if you want to use this kind of process for deciding future strategy, then we would strongly advocate that you take that additional step of using financial proxies to monetize your outcomes. Now, we're not going to get into you know, very technical stuff around financial monetization. We could probably do a separate webinar just on that subject. But there is, you know, there is lots of stuff on the internet and lots of material available about how to go about actually putting value on change, whether it's well-being for people or other types of change and outcomes. We would say, don't let this intimidate you, this aspect. There's loads of information available, particularly in this area of assigning value to the change that your work is creating. So this business of attaching monetary values does at least facilitate a situation where you're able to think about the social value you're creating, and then you can do things like you know, calculate a social return figure, or look at a payback period in a business sense for you know, the time it takes to you know, return a value that's equal to the investment itself is often a business technique that's used to actually judge the effectiveness of an emerging business. So that's the accounting for social value, the social value process that we would use. This just to finalize the kind of let's look at the method initially. This stuff takes careful planning. I know these boxes look innocuous and it looks like you could just easily step your way through those and do them, but there's a bit of planning and certainly a bit of work that needs to go into thinking about how you're going to get the data for the outcomes that you're going to actually identify and claim. And of course, at the back end of the process, you need to be thinking about what kind of report you will produce and you know, particularly who your audience is and that type of thing. We'll talk just a wee bit more about the messaging later on in the webinar, but I'll move on for now. Just to say that outcomes data and measurement is a part of this process. That's really important, and that you need to think about, you know, planning research for if you're going to, you know, do this kind of work long term. So moving on to honing the message, what has just preceded is the basis of any kind of outcomes or impact framework that we would set up when we're working with colleagues. But it's about getting to this point, really. It's about thinking of a way to actually articulate your story. I think a good impact report consists of words and numbers. So the numbers is the calculation, modeling, you know, to get you to some of the results. But frankly, that's useless without being able to actually tell your story. So I think one of the things I would say is one of the things we need to be doing is, you know, telling the story. The story has to be, I would have thought, around, you know, this is the value that we create. There's an element, as I've said, where you want to identify clearly that the value is down to your work. It's largely attributable to you. This fourth one, that it wouldn't happen otherwise, is a very useful thing to be able to say. And then after that, it's about strategy, how you intend to use the information to make future decisions. I'm just going to touch briefly on these. We're not going to spend a lot of time. Again, this could be the subject of a complete webinar, but these are the 7 principles that have been developed over a period of time, but inform, if you like, the elements that should be considered. I would argue in terms of any piece of evaluation whatsoever, never mind an impact report or a social return on investment report. And they all kind of inform important different areas, knowing what's changing, being clear that you need to think about not ignoring outcomes that are difficult to gather or difficult to measure in value. C number 4 there, I've touched on this, only include what's material. And then the others are about considering the counterfactual and being really transparent about any assumptions that your impact work is making in order to get towards the very last one here, which is about verifying the result with stakeholders. But we're just going to touch on the first one in terms of actual experience. I thought I'd show you this. It's a real piece of stakeholder engagement that I took part in a few years back. I thought I'd show you this to remind you what the world used to look like, because of course you're certainly not going to be able to be doing this kind of engagement at this point in time. And I'm shortly going to ask Penny to come in and talk about just to change the voice, but also to introduce you to Penny, who's become an expert for us in terms of the stakeholder engagement that we've been doing. But one of the things we kind of aim to do is certainly to take stakeholders with us, not just in terms of identifying outcomes, but also the later processes of analysing and valuing outcomes. And Penny's going to come in very shortly, but just to show you this, this is the definition that's used in the impact world for a stakeholder, slightly different possibly to how the stakeholder terms used elsewhere. But for us in the impact world, people who experience change through your activity or influence the way you run it, that's a useful definition in terms of deciding perhaps who your primary stakeholders are. But Penny, would you like to come and talk to us just for a while in terms of something of our experience of working with stakeholders?
Sure, absolutely.
We're not getting a good connection with Penny so far. She's, I suspect she's logging off, folks, and coming back on again. She was just going to talk a bit about some of the key experiences we've had from talking directly with stakeholders. I'll just give it a minute to see if she's able to.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you now, Penny. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to leave my video off because that might help with my bandwidth.
Okay.
So let's try take 2. Oh, the wonders of technology. Yeah, so as I was saying, hi everyone. Thanks, Carl. As Carl mentioned, I'm just going to chat through a couple of these points on the slide around stakeholder engagement and drawing on some of the experience that both myself and the teams had both in lockdown and out of lockdown. So hopefully it will just give you some and food for thought on how you can run stakeholder engagement, because obviously when you run it, talking to your stakeholders and your service users, you want to get really good, rich and relevant outcomes data. And so how do we do that just generally and also specifically in lockdown that's posing challenges for us? So just start off, I guess, reflecting on some of the key experiences from talking directly to stakeholders. I think the main one really when I think about this is how much I find that stakeholders really enjoy the process. I always thoroughly enjoy talking to stakeholders and engaging with them, and I find that they really appreciate that. You know, a lot of the time as charities we might sort of talk to staff and make assumptions around what the outcomes are, but actually although stakeholders, the way that they articulate the outcomes for themselves might not match, you know, the technical language that you use, if you pose the right questions, they are usually really aware, you know, and conscious of the changes that they're experiencing. And when we talk about running stakeholder engagement, I guess, what does this look like practically? You'll see in point 2, we talk about running focus groups. This is our preferred method because we find that it gives that sort of group consensus. But as you know, depending on what's sort of appropriate for your activity and your stakeholders, you may be running sort of interviews or questionnaires. Obviously, focus groups, as you know, just aren't possible at the moment. So the stakeholder engagement that we've been running has been either via Zoom or telephone during lockdown. But the focus groups, when we are able to, are a great way to engage with stakeholders. And obviously sort of creating that safe environment where people feel comfortable is really important. So whatever you do to try and facilitate that environment. And size is quite a key issue. So we sort of prefer to work in about groups of 10, but if you have a bigger group, say you've got 20 or so, it's an idea to sort of split them into 2 smaller groups and run sort of parallel sessions. And so that's quite important to make sure you sort of hear everyone's opinion, of course. And another really key thing that I find, particularly if you're starting off on this journey, but anywhere, anytime, really, is to think really clearly and carefully through the questions that you're going to ask, and reflecting back on what Carl was talking about, you know, getting an idea of those outcomes, getting an idea of materiality and importance, and also what's attributable to you. So really thinking through those and having well-defined questions is really key for a focus group or any stakeholder engagement, really. And a flip chart is fantastic. That is a great piece of advice if you're running a focus group, to have one of those, and that can really anchor the session and the outcomes that are coming out. Point 3 is really about sort of strategies for dealing with situations when you can't access stakeholders, which is really relevant for us at the moment. Of course, a lot of charities are not able to directly talk to their stakeholders. But I guess we would sort of encourage you not to sort of abandon it altogether during this time, and think about how you can. So I guess if our stakeholders as well perhaps too ill to talk to, or too young, or there's some sort of issue, think about who's sort of in their life that will be able to reflect on the changes on their behalf and speak by proxy really for them. And that might be, you know, it might be family members or loved ones, or it might be, you know, volunteers that work with them, or even members of staff. And as I said, during this time at the moment, during lockdown, that might be particularly relevant for you. Some challenges from engagement experiences. There's always things that crop up, really. I just thought it might be, you know, worth mentioning again what Carl was talking about. You know, historically, we've taught, or we separate outputs and outcomes, and that's really important. And sometimes we can find, when talking to stakeholders, that we get a bit caught up, they get caught up on reporting on the outputs. And whilst, you know, we do, that information is important, we really are key, and what's key for us in stakeholder engagement is to find out the outcomes. So asking those questions and finding out what changes for them. So trying to redirect people into focusing on the changes for them. And what are the sort of questions that we ask? So that's a really interesting one, because as I said earlier on in the slide, asking the right questions is really important, so that you can get that outcomes data that you can use to look at your impact and understand and articulate your impact. So our key question really is, we ask whether I'm talking to someone over the phone or talking to someone in a group, is really asking them about the changes that they've experienced as a result of participating in the particular activity or program that you're looking at. So asking them, you know, since taking part, what changes have you experienced in your life? And once we've got a really good idea on the outcomes and the changes for stakeholders, Carl was talking about materiality, and one of the ways we can assess that is asking our stakeholders about how important the outcomes are for them. So depending on how you want to do it, or sort of what you need at the moment. I've been running the stakeholder engagement sessions I've been running over the phone, when I will just ask stakeholders to rate it in terms of the importance for them on a scale of 1 to 10. Negative changes is just back one, and then thank you. Negative changes is an important one as well. We want to find out about the positive changes, of course, but it's important to also find out from stakeholders about if any negative changes that they've experienced. And we want to remember that we want to try and uncover the intended, unintended, positive and negative changes for stakeholders. And just finally, really on the slide, managing engagement during the pandemic. As I said, we've touched on that, it's not ideal at the moment, but I was thinking on the stakeholder engagement that I've done at the moment, that on one level, we have a bit of an opportunity actually, because people are perhaps, there might be particular stakeholder groups that are not engaged in programs at the moment, but might have a bit of space and time at the moment sort of outside the activity to reflect. So the engagement that we've been doing at the moment has been with volunteers, and actually there's been a bit of an opportunity because it's not as complicated to find the time that, you know, both myself and them are available. So obviously you've got sort of your Zoom and telephone, and that's the only way we can really do it. But as I said at the beginning, sort of don't abandon it altogether and see what is possible for you. And finally, really just relates to the first point that stakeholders really do enjoy it, and sometimes charities feel that they might be putting an extra burden on asking stakeholders to engage in, you know, some impact research, but actually we find it's really quite the opposite. They get a lot out of it. They really appreciate their voices being heard, their opinion being heard, and they want to be able to contribute because they know that this is going to help the organization sort of grow even further and develop even further. And yeah, this slide really is just to be about being realistic about what you can achieve. You know, at the moment there are some limitations, and think about keeping it simple. Think about, you know, how you can engage with them, and looking at attribution and dead weights. You know, how much information can you get from your stakeholders at this time, and what are those questions that you can ask? And thorough stakeholder mapping. That's a really good one to think through and really important, because often we usually have sort of your main beneficiary group or your key beneficiary or service user group, but there's 9 times out of 10, there's always other stakeholder groups that are experiencing change as well. So that may well be, say, loved ones, for example, or as I've mentioned, a volunteer group. And so doing a thorough stakeholder mapping and thinking who your different groups are and who then you can engage with and how you can. And finally, this list here at the bottom of the slide is not exhaustive, but there's a few ideas of different tools that you can use during this time now that we're in lockdown. So have a look at those, and we'll mention at the end, but we're very happy to talk to you about any ideas that you had, or think through, you know, how you can do stakeholder engagement, impact measurement during this time.
Lovely, thank you, Penny. Gives us an insight into some of the work you've been doing. Moving on again, another why this is useful. Well, recently some people were asking questions about, you know, the situation we find ourselves in today, and you know, how do you go about creating the balance between measuring some of the impact in the short term for, say, some of your work you're doing in response to the crisis, while still thinking in terms of, you know, the fact that you'll be here today, but also here tomorrow as well, that there is the round the corner journey to take, and the immediate future to think about. And some of the questions were raised around, you know, if we don't have an impact framework right now, you know, what tools can we use, or how can we go about actually thinking about impact, and you know, that we could have this week or next week. And you know, there are some key areas here. I think it's an investment for the future, actually, to think about putting in place a framework which will arrange these things for you. But one of the big questions is, what data do you already have, for example, which might feed very well into making the claim of the change you're thinking about? Can you show a direct link to the higher value outcomes that you know would solve the immediate problem that you're kind of applying yourself to amid the pandemic? So it's back to this efficacy of outputs again, and thinking, in a crisis situation, what action do we need to take that would add social value? And maybe you don't need, and certainly you don't have the time at the minute to create a huge framework and think about a range of outcomes for different stakeholders and how you measure and value those. But it's quite possible to be thinking in terms of a shorter term approach to at least indicatively suggesting areas where you can have a higher impact as opposed to a lower impact. Maybe that kind of thinking is good enough in terms of the immediate sort of pressures upon us. But creating social value and moving into the future is equally important. Over the last couple of webinars, we've shown it's a piece of work that was carried out by Cass, actually, and we've shown an illustration of that piece of work. It was to do with charities being agile and so on in the future. It was as a result of a series of different conversations that were had around the country by invitation. And one of the things that came out of that was actually the piece was written by Mark Solway, who heads up our unit that I've introduced you to, and it was also funded by Barclays Bank. But some of the things that came out of that work were about sustainability, being able to think, efficiently about moving forward, maximizing your outputs against resources. If you are a charity and you've got two outcomes in mind that you want to create for the people you're working with, you could probably spend all the money you've got in hand to actually do that. So there is this word efficiency that sometimes we're nervous of in the charitable sector. How can you maximize outputs against the resources you've got? Could you create the same outcomes for less resource? So that takes us into the whole area of thinking about the kinds of charities that we will need to create to survive this pandemic and move into the future. And then it's essentially questions about what drives you. We've shown this slide in a couple of previous webinars also, and time is moving on, so I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on this, but you can tell looking at this that it's really posing the question: are you led by impact or are you led by the money? And the upper right hand quadrant is where you want to get your activities, those that are impactful and providing income. And then some of the other areas, you can have good income but poor impact. Do you continue to do those things? But I want to shift our emphasis away from that to the other things on this slide, which are about thinking about costing your services. What does creating outcomes actually cost you? And do you understand your finance in order to understand the mechanics of how you create impact? And I'm going to invite my colleague Marcus in now just to talk about this next slide. Marcus is an expert in the whole area of thinking about costing and finance and the business models that go around financial matters. So Marcus, could you talk us through this next one?
Perfect. Thanks, Carl. I suppose along with the rest of this presentation, the slides in here, this slide alone could easily be a whole webinar in itself. And actually, in 2 weeks' time, we are doing a webinar on cost recovery. So if I get longer than 5 minutes, I can spend a full hour boring you to tears about all things charity finance then. So first off, we're just going to say, even though we're talking about all the impact here, it's also worth knowing, okay, how much does it really cost us to make that impact? And without knowing what it really costs you, are you going to be able to see whether you're getting value for money on that impact? Is the service actually costing you or making you money? If you, it's all well and good, everyone will be able to tell you what a different service makes, but they may not be able to tell you what a different service costs. And so keeping an eye on those costs and actually being able to monitor them, measure them, is really important. Overheads and cost recovery, as I said, are a whole webinar session in and of themselves. But this is about just making sure that you are counting those when you're looking at what your service costs you. Are you looking at just those direct attributable costs, or are you also including that portion of overheads to reach a true cost of your activity or service? I mean, the main thing I'd say here about the costs behind the impact that you're looking for is to say that transparency is really, really crucial here. And when I say transparency, I'm meaning both internally and externally, because from an internal perspective, if you don't know what something costs you, how are you going to be able to measure any potential funding gap? And how are you then going to be able to sign off any potential funding gap? And so if you're not measuring those costs, then your decision makers in your organizations, your trustees and your management are not given the clarity with which to make decisions, such as, do we need to look at reducing costs in this service? Do we need to look at stopping the service altogether because we're not getting enough impact for this cost that we're doing, or our reserves can't fund it year on year? But equally, external transparency, being able to cost your services enables you to have more transparent, more open discussions with your funders. If you can tell them what it really costs you to run a service, then you have a better chance of being able to get that money in your ask. If a funder is only willing to fund a service to the tune of £100,000, rather than just saying to the funder, yep, it costs us £100,000, we'll take it, being able to go back to them and go, yes, we have looked at this internally and we're willing to sign off on a gap and to do this service, but we just want to let you know that actually it costs us £120,000 to run this service. So we are funding this service partly ourselves out of our reserves or out of our fundraising. And being able to have that open discussion really puts you in a powerful position to not only try and get that £100,000, that extra £20,000, say, then and there, but also next year when you go back to rebid for that contract or grant, to be able to say, last year we funded this to the tune of £20,000 ourselves. We wanted to do this work and we believe in it. Now that we've done it for a year, you can look back and say, look at all this. Look at all these outcomes that we achieved for this work, and to be able to show how worthwhile the service is, and to try and get that extra bit of funding. And so, yeah, that's me. And I'll say that in 2 weeks' time, we'll be doing a full hour on cost recovery and why knowing your cost base is really important for organisations, particularly at a time like this.
Great, Marcus. Thanks for that. We'll look forward to that in 2 weeks' time. So, just moving on now, I want to move fairly quickly so that we can bring Bruce in a short time and just talk a little bit about his experience of doing this kind of stuff with us. But here's something that I think's well worthwhile looking at briefly, because I think if you have an effective impact measurement system, there's two areas. There's the internal messaging and there's the external stuff. People sometimes apologize for coming to us to talk about impact because they want to use it to fundraise, and of course, that's quite common. But also, there's important internal messaging to think about as well. How can we maximize the impact, not just for the sake of it, but because it actually gives you a lead in to the strategy that could hold a more secure future for you if you're actually carrying out work that will benefit stakeholders. So this, you know, what decisions do we need to take right now? That's an important element. Is there a risk to current activities, you know, in terms of losing impact? Those are all things that a measurement system can actually do for you. And actually looking forward to the change, the external messaging, it's not just about fundraising. There's very often the bigger charities have a PR section and the messaging that goes out in terms of attracting interest. But as we come out of this pandemic, and there's a lot of talk about the new normal, we're also thinking about how boards and their senior staff teams are facing strategic change. And some of that is going to actually impact on you know, the kind of fundraising messaging that we actually put out there. And that's a good time to invite my colleague Dan, just to say something about it. Dan has some experience both at board level and you know, leading us in terms of you know, fundraising strategy and so on. Dan has an experience just of how these things might have to change a bit in the future. Dan, are you there? Are you able to speak
Yes.
to the next slide?
Hi there, Carl. Hello, everybody. Yes, just very briefly, this next slide sort of builds on what Marcus was saying and Carl. In the fundraising advice and strategy work that I do with charities, it's very important that good fundraising begins with a compelling case of support, one that you really understand where the difference is being made, where your charity is actually having that most impact on your beneficiaries. But it's also important to, with your trustees in particular, that their role as governors of the charity, they have a key role in the charity strategy and the fundraising strategy, and the two of those should go hand in hand. They should be closely linked. Fundraising strategy shouldn't be going off in one direction where at odds with your charity's strategy. If you understand your impact as well as you possibly can do, then your charitable strategy and your fundraising strategy will be aligned. And I've worked with a number of our clients that Carl has also done some impact studies with them, and those impact studies have really helped to refine that strategic direction. They've provided ammunition to the boards to really get to grips with what it is that charity is doing and where it's making the most difference. And so then they are able to understand or to direct and give that direction to the fundraising income generation teams to ensure that where they're focusing their efforts links back to where that most impact is created, and which affects the strategic direction of the charity. And for me, I suppose the most important aspect of that is that it's enabling the charity through the board and through the strategic direction that they're giving to align both where the beneficiaries needs are met and also where the funders needs are met. The funders have money that they want to spend on certain things happening to beneficiaries. Beneficiaries have certain needs that can only be met when this money is spent, and the charity is there in the middle between the funder and the beneficiary. And if you can get a better understanding of the difference that you make, that efficacy that Carl has been talking about earlier, then beneficiary needs and funder needs are neatly aligned, and that's where a board is really doing their best job. So I think that's all I need to say on that, and I'll pass over to Bruce.
Lovely, Dan. Thanks very much. Hiya, Bruce. Are you there? Let me introduce Bruce Leake. Bruce is the Chief Executive of Suffolk Libraries. I love the website when you go on it because it talks about lending and facilities, but also investment in well-being and the health of the local community. Bruce, you got very interested in the impact work. What made you want to identify your impact?
Hi everybody, and hi Carl. essentially, we're a charity that runs libraries in Suffolk. And we're paid by the local authority, Suffolk County Council, to do that. We were the first library service to be divested about 8 years ago. And the key reason that we wanted to show our social impact, and particularly our social value, was to, I guess, find a financial metric that highlighted not just that social value, but also savings that we were making to other parts of the sort of social economy, so the social services, the NHS and stuff like that. And that's of great value to us because obviously we're a service that is contracted by Suffolk County Council, and coming up to a tender process, we needed to really show that value.
That's interesting. What people will be wondering is whether commissioners of your kind of service really are interested in social value and what you create in terms of social value. I
mean, Suffolk County Council, I can speak for them, and they certainly are. Almost everything that they assess, most of their commissioning work around, is based on impact now, and their own methodology, I suspect, is fairly limited compared to the work that we did with you at MOOR Kingston Smith, but they definitely understand the importance of impact. Yes.
Was there, when you were going about thinking of the design of your impact work, and I know you came to us and had a number of conversations, but was there a reason that you looked into the impact of particular services? Did you start small, or did you, because you're across, I think we talked about 40 premises or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we have 44 libraries, we have a mobile library service, and we have a number of pop-up libraries, and we also run prison libraries across the country. And the reason that we're so focused on wellbeing is because we run over 14,000 events, activities and experiences at our various sites every year. And almost all of those events, activities and experiences, which are a vast diversity of things, support improvements in people's wellbeing, but we just had nothing concrete that proved that, and we've done some other work on that, and so why particularly, again, we were interested in impact was because we wanted to bring to life the wellbeing value of the work that we were doing, which isn't something that people readily associate with libraries, and we wanted to move away from just being seen as a basic book borrowing service to one that has a much deeper impact on the fabric of society.
It's interesting. I know after the work was completed, Bruce, you'd quite an active sort of PR sort of section within your portfolio. I think it attracted some media attention, including BBC Radio and so on. Did you find that useful in terms of did they understand? Did the local community understand what you meant by impact?
Yeah, they did. Again, I think it brings to life the story that we're trying to tell, which is much more about our role in supporting people's well-being as opposed to probably people's stereotypical view of the library. So from that perspective, the PR was massively helpful. The other thing that was really interesting and that we hadn't realised was that it's the first time that a library service in the UK had ever undertaken this type of work. So other library services from across the country were also very interested in not just the methodology, but also in the results. And especially, as I should have said, sorry, in answer to your last question briefly, we did only look at 3 areas that we focus on in terms of events, activities and experiences out of about, over 500 to 600 things that we do every year. So it was a very small sample of our activities that we focused on as part of the work we did with MOOR Kingston Smith.
Is there more that you want to do yourselves, Bruce? Will you be able to take it forward? There's a slide up just now that will show people the kind of analysis, just very simply. The stuff on the right-hand side were the kind of final outcomes for one of the groups that Bruce has just mentioned. Is there stuff you want to take forward yourself with this, Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, we'd love to measure the social value and impact of our entire service, because obviously we only did a really small snapshot in the work that we did with you, although it was a very involved and detailed process. And now that we're in lockdown, we're obviously having to rethink the way we deliver our service. So, for instance, rather than doing some of the physical activities, some of the activities in a physical environment, we're doing them virtually now. But we're also we've set up a phone service as well. So those are the things that we'll probably be looking to assess in the future, which will play a bigger role as I'm assuming we go in and out of lockdowns and things change in the way that we deliver, but impact and showing that those things are providing a similar level or even more value than socially than what we were doing previously will be really important on our ongoing conversations with Suffolk County Council. So yes, a much broader process is going to be really important for us.
Okay, more to do. Finally, Bruce, thanks for joining us. It's good to have a sort of some practical experience. If people are listening to this and just wondering how they might start out on a journey like this, would you have any tips for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, I mean, one of the things that was easy for us is that we have, because we have all those events, activities and experiences, essentially we had all the stakeholder groups together in one place for you guys to interview. So my one piece of advice would be to make sure that you're already clear on how you can engage with those stakeholders. A secondary thing would be to start with the end in mind. Obviously, I think you've already highlighted that several times during the presentation, but we knew really clearly the outcome that we were looking for. And I think we hoped for the outcome that your report delivered for us, but actually what you delivered was even better than the end we had in mind. So that was fantastic. And the third thing was just make sure you know how to use it in the best possible way to leverage hopefully the positive impact statement that you'll get back. And as Carl said about telling a story, I think the report you did for us told a great story, but we found different ways of telling that story across all sorts of platforms which help with PR and help support our case for support and potentially our relationship with funders in the future.
Great. Okay. Bruce, I'm not sure I should give up my day job and attempt to be an interviewer or something like that. But
oh, you're a lot better than it's all about the interviewee as well, Carl. So.
No,
I've got 2 6-year-olds going hammer and tongs outside with their cars as well. So
maybe you need to go and recover that situation. But we appreciate you joining us, Bruce. Thanks a lot, and thanks again.
Thank you.
So, folks, we're coming just to the end of today's webinar. There might be 1 or 2 questions. This is just a final touch here. We've talked about measuring impact, and we've said a little about the structure of that and the how, and hopefully given you a number of reasons why it's still a very useful thing to do. Can be done short term, indicatively, but maybe also we need to invest in thinking about long term. But it's of no value essentially without you thinking about what you want to use it for. And essentially it's good to know your impact, but also it's really good to use it for something in terms of managing change. And very often we're in a situation where we can identify outcomes. On the right-hand side of this model here, they could be of high value or lower value, but if they lead to strategic decision-making and also lead to some of the messaging that can promote your organization at the same time, then that's something that can be, really useful in terms of having some sort of framework that will track your impact as you go forward. I don't want to say too much more. Are there any key questions that we should answer before we've only a few minutes left, but is there any key question that we could address? If not, if anyone has...
Oh, there were some questions.
We've got a few here, Carl.
Yes.
Have we? Thank you.
Yeah.
Marcus, you take.
Perfect. So I was just going to read out here. We've got one from Brendan here who says, as a Suffolk Library user, I see your wider activities in the community. How do you measure health and well-being? What tools do you use?
So what we did at Suffolk Libraries was first of all we identified whether improved health or improved well-being was something that was being reported by the groups that we were engaging with. And it was in both cases. There was mental health was also an issue, and what we did was, having identified that those were outcomes, then we needed to get some feel of to what extent the change happened as a result of the work of Suffolk Libraries. And there's once you've identified that and been able to get to a point where you've been able to clearly show that there's movement, distance traveled, as we say, you're able to actually, show that is something that's really worthwhile. And we would use something like the Warwick-Edinburgh scale to show the movement or the distance traveled that I talked about. So that we would consider that as an indicator of change. And then we would value the change in terms of, as I talked about earlier, what is the monetary value that you could put on that? And that's often, been able to show the difference for the person if they're able to avoid, problems with taking their drugs in the case of mental health, for example. So these different areas, you would need to see the wider framework, but essentially we were able to show that there was movement in a particular area in terms of people having more positive mental health, and B, that was worth something both to them and to the rest of society.
There's a question here from Lisa from Bristol, who asks, who usually drives the impact reporting within organisations? So it's more of a sort of management question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's sometimes driven from, I'm just thinking of the people we've worked with before. It's usually driven from someone with an operational brief, because they want that to inform the future design of operations. Occasionally, it's been driven by someone with a financial role, where they're wanting to, show both the impact of how finance is invested in the charity, for example, and occasionally it's driven from an effective chief executive who wants to make sure that the organization is fit for purpose in the future and is that's addressing sustainability and things like that for them. So it can vary, but my experience tells me it's often one of those three.
We have a question here from Tim, who says, Bruce, how do you assign a monetary value to the right-hand side of, that was this diagram here that I've just put back up?
Well, that we could spend a whole webinar on that, but for example, things like increasing enjoyment of daily life, improved quality of life. There's a whole section of literature on the value of improved well-being, for example. One of the guys that you could look up who's writing in this field is a guy called Daniel Fujiwara, F-U-J-I-W-A-R-I, and W-A-R-A, sorry. Daniel Fujiwara. If you Google Daniel, you'll see that the kinds of things that we would use to put a value on, say, improved quality of life, there's a whole literature around that, and in fact, it's used by government bodies to predict future planning and future quality of life issues as we think about planning over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So there's plenty in the literature which covers that.
Okay, there were a couple of questions from Douglas and Brendan about resources, case studies and things like that. And I think I'm right in saying that those will be going out with a follow-up email that the people will get after today's webinar, probably sometime tomorrow morning. And there's some more resources on the screen there as well. But there's also a question from Adrienne Arthurs, how to show impact for the future predicted need based on the work we've been doing to respond to COVID. So it's about impact of things that predicted impact about the future. How do you work with that in the very sort of current issues around dealing with COVID, which is obviously stuff which still remains unknowns at this point in time?
Yeah, there's a whole area here that sort of things are unknown, and there's things that will emerge. We don't know everything about this virus, therefore we don't know the total effects on people's lives. So we are a bit stuck with some of the metrics that we have, and those will change as time goes on. If you're thinking about both physical and mental health that results from us all going through a pandemic, one of the things that's useful about a framework is that it can be adjusted as time goes on for different kinds of data, and certainly the calculation model we use and the kind of predictive modeling that we have in time needs to remain flexible so that new kinds of data can be plugged into that. But I appreciate it's not just always straightforward, and therefore we need to have the benefit of gathering data in the future and being able to look back at some stage. I think in a year's time we'll have a very different view of what this period of time was about and was like, and we'll know more about the impacts on people's lives and in the community. But I think, folks, we've just gone over time. If you have a question, certainly do feel free. There's some on the next slide, for example. We've got some contact information. Do keep an eye on the impact resources that we've got here just in front of us. Some of this is really useful. For example, if you're interested in impact, the measurement toolkit has just been put up on our website in the last couple of days. We're trying to do these webinars just to keep in contact with people. We're here to help. It is first and foremost our motivation in this. Marcus has mentioned the full cost recovery webinar that's coming up in a fortnight's time. But if you have a situation whereby you'd love to sit down with us over the telephone or whatever and talk to us about a particular situation you're in or a particular problem you're having, either in impact or in the area of fundraising, or indeed the area that Marcus was talking about, understanding finance more fully, we're offering these 30-minute surgery slots. Do please feel free to book one of those with us. They're entirely free. They're completely without obligation, and we're here to help. We'd love to sit down with you, and whether it's impact or finance, fundraising, whichever of those areas it is, or even a combination of those, we'd be very happy to book you one of those slots and try and support you just through that forum. Do feel free to make contact with us. Here we are by telephone, or come through to me either by email or phone, and I can pass you on to the right people within our little unit. So it just remains for me to thank you for staying with us. I hope you found this useful. It may just begin to raise questions rather than answer everything, but as I say, do please feel free to come back to us and continue the conversation. So thanks very much.